George Carlin was sitting in the back of a police car when nobody thought his career was over, except everyone around him. What he had said on stage at the Milwaukee Summerfest had been deemed obscene, and the arrest was inevitable. NBC made a quiet decision that same week Carlin would no longer appear on The Tonight Show. 3 years passed. 3 years in which Carlin vanished from mainstream television, major contracts disappeared, and old friends stopped calling. But Carlin didn't stop. He kept performing in small venues on university campuses for cheap tickets. In 1975, a performance he gave at USC was recorded, and that recording became an underground legend. It passed from hand to hand, got played on radio stations, people told each other about it. When Johnny Carson heard that recording, he called his producer and said one thing: find him. The night Carlin returned to the Tonight Show stage, he locked eyes with Carson. Neither said anything, at least not until the cameras rolled, but in that look was 3 years of reckoning. And what Carlin said to Carson that night went far beyond anything anyone in that studio expected. To understand this story, we need to go back to the late 1960s, to the time when George Carlin was still America's safe comedian. In those years, Carlin was a regular guest on The Tonight Show. Every appearance followed the same rhythm: neat hair, sharp suit, white shirt. He'd walk out, take the mic, make the audience laugh, cross over to Carson's desk, drink his coffee, say his goodbyes. NBC's producers were happy. The audience liked him. Everything was in order. But something was growing inside Carlin, and it grew a little more each day. Carlin had grown up in Fort Worth, Texas in the late 1950s. An absent father, poverty, the rigid discipline of Catholic schools. Words had been a weapon for him from an early age, both escape and reckoning. After returning from the military, he turned to comedy, watched Lenny Bruce perform, got to know Richard Pryor. What these men carried onto the stage shook him to his core, telling the truth, without decoration, even if it hurt. But when the Tonight Show doors opened in the mid-1960s, Carlin made a different calculation. Let me get inside first, he thought. Then I'll say it. Years passed, he got inside, but he couldn't say it. The clearest illustration of this comes from an anecdote producer Fred DeCordova shared in a later interview. Toward the end of 1969, before a Tonight Show taping, Carlin was sitting in the dressing room buttoning his suit jacket when he caught his own reflection in the mirror. He stared for a long time. Then he turned to the assistant beside him and asked, "Do you think this is actually me?" The assistant didn't know what to say. Carlin stood up, walked out to the stage, and delivered a flawless performance that night. The audience laughed. Carson applauded. NBC was satisfied. But the question in front of that mirror had kept on growing. That detail would become important very soon. By early 1970, the tone of Carlin's stage work was beginning to shift. Slowly at first, then with increasing clarity. His routines were no longer harmless observations. He touched on Vietnam, prodded at the system. His view of religious institutions grew sharper. Small venue audiences responded with enthusiasm. But NBC's eyes were open too. In those days, before every Tonight Show appearance, producers would send Carlin a materials list: what he could say, what he couldn't. Carlin would look at the list, nod his head. Then he'd walk out and push exactly up to the edge of those limits. Never crossing, but making you feel like he might at any second. It was a game, and Carlin played it masterfully. But toward the end of 1971, after a Tonight Show taping, producer Fred DeCordova pulled Carlin aside. His voice was low, but the message was clear. "George, this direction is making us uncomfortable. Pull it back a little." What did Carlin feel in that moment? He described it years later in an interview. "There were two voices inside me. One said okay, the other said no. And for the first time I noticed the second voice was louder. But that day, he said okay. Again. Spring 1972. Carlin's agency brought big news. Milwaukee Summerfest, an outdoor festival, a crowd of thousands, good money. Carlin accepted. But something had changed. He had made a decision. In the week leading up to that night, Carlin rewrote his routines. He threw out the old ones. He prepared new material, material that broke every rule on NBC's list, that tore down every boundary. He didn't call his manager, didn't ask the producer. Alone in a hotel room, smoking cigarettes, he wrote. The night of June 1972, when Carlin walked onto that stage, he wasn't wearing a suit for the first time. The audience found it odd, but laughed. Then Carlin began to speak. Words flowed, uncensored, raw, sharp. For 45 minutes, he said what he'd wanted to say, without decoration. When the show ended, 2 police officers were waiting at the stage exit. Carlin was being handcuffed while applause was still coming from inside the stage. Carson noticed something had shifted. The audience didn't, not yet. The charge was formal, obscene language. The case dragged on for months before being dismissed. But the damage was already done. The newspapers blew up the story. NBC made its quiet decision that week and sent a single-sentence message to Carlin's agency. He will be kept off the program for a while. For a while that lasted 3 years. Carlin's life became unrecognizable within months. Major television contracts ended. Las Vegas doors closed. In that era, Vegas was a comedian's golden ticket, and Carlin lost that ticket. Former managers started saying not available. Some friends stopped answering the phone. Money got tight. Seriously tight. Carlin had also increased his drug use during this period. He never hid it. He spoke about it openly in later years. It was both escape and a kind of anger, he'd say afterward. I was escaping not from the system but from myself. But he didn't stop. University campuses opened their doors to him. Small, disheveled halls, student crowds, cheap tickets. In these venues, Carlin discovered something different. Freedom. NBC's list didn't exist here. No producer whispering in his ear. Just him and the microphone and what he wanted to say. His routines sharpened, his language intensified. 7 words you can never say on television was born in this period. A routine that listed the 7 words America couldn't say on TV one after another. Both philosophical and funny. Both angry and entertaining. Audiences went wild. And in 1975, on a night at USC in Los Angeles, someone recorded that performance. That tape spread quickly. Radio stations played it. Journalists wrote about it. Rolling Stone took notice, and within weeks the thousands of people making copies of that tape, passing it to friends listening to it, were all saying the same thing. Where is this guy? Johnny Carson heard that recording in November 1975. He called producer Fred DeCordova, and what he said was one sentence: find him. No one, not Carson, not the producers, not the audience at home, was fully prepared for what that phone call would set in motion. December 1975, NBC Studios, Burbank, California, 5 p.m., 2 hours before the taping. Carlin was sitting in the dressing room, in front of the mirror, just like 6 years ago, but this time there was no suit. A faded shirt, jeans, grown-out hair. He looked at the mirror. This time it felt different. This time the man looking back was himself. There was a knock at the door. An assistant entered. Mr. Carlin, Mr. Carson would like to see you. Carlin stood up. His steps were slow as he walked down the corridor. He wasn't in a hurry. When he reached Carson's dressing room, the door was ajar. He went in. Carson was sitting at his desk, looking at a sheet of paper. When he saw Carlin, he stood up. He extended his hand. The 2 men shook hands. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Then, before Carson could say anything, Carlin spoke. "Johnny," he said. His voice was calm. "I'm not going to apologize." The studio corridor was silent. From somewhere outside came the sound of someone's footsteps, an assistant running somewhere. But in that room, time had stopped. Carson looked at Carlin. He looked for a long time, then slowly smiled. "Who asked you to?" he said. Carlin froze for a moment. This wasn't the answer he'd expected. In his mind there were dozens of people who had walked in and out of that room over 3 years. Those who wanted an apology, those who demanded an explanation, those who asked, "Why did you do it?" Carson was doing none of those things. "Sit down," said Carson. "Let's talk." The 20 minutes that passed before that night's taping began were described by de Cordova years later. Sounds of laughter were coming from that room. First low, then rising, two men were talking as if they'd never been apart. But in the middle of that conversation, Carson said something, and Carlin's face suddenly changed. When the cameras lit up and Carlin walked out onto the stage, the audience rose to their feet. Long, thunderous applause. Carlin stood in the middle of the stage and looked out at the crowd. His eyes were shining. Everyone in the studio that night noticed it. One audience member wrote in a letter afterward, "The man who walked out onto that stage was someone taking his first breath." The performance ended. Carlin crossed to Carson's desk, sat down. Carson turned to him. "How was it?" Carson asked. Simple, calm, sincere. Carlin thought for a moment. Then he said, "Every time I sat in this chair 3 years ago, there was a voice inside me saying, 'This isn't you.' Tonight that voice went quiet." The studio fell silent. Carson leaned toward the microphone, then pulled back. He just looked at Carlin, then nodded, a nod that needed no words, that understood everything. The audience may not have fully grasped what had happened, but the millions of people watching that moment on their screens felt that something had changed. This wasn't just a comedian's comeback. This was a man coming back to himself. But the real secret of that night was in the part that never made it to air. Carson had not been silent during the 3 years Carlin was kept away by NBC. Neither Carlin nor the public knew this. The truth emerged in an interview de Cordova gave in the late 1990s. Toward the end of 1972, while the Milwaukee case was still ongoing, Carson had held a private meeting with NBC executives. There was one topic on the table: Carlin. Carson had sat down and told the executives, "This man will come back one day, and when he does, the doors will be open." The executives had objected. Carson hadn't backed down. Johnny didn't defend Carlin publicly during that period, de Cordova said in that interview, because doing so wouldn't have helped Carlin, it would have hurt him. It would have strained the relationship with NBC even further. But behind the curtain, it was Carson who made sure that door never fully closed. Carlin learned this that night in the dressing room. It was what Carson had said before the taping. "The door was never closed, George. It just stayed ajar." And that was the moment Carlin's face changed. When the taping ended that night, Carlin didn't go straight back to the dressing room. He stood at the edge of the stage and looked out at the emptying studio. The lights were going out one by one. The technical crew was gathering cables. Chairs were being pushed back into place. The stage that moments ago millions of eyes had been fixed on through their screens had now become an ordinary room. Carson came to stand beside him. The two men stood side by side for a while. "Come back next week," said Carson. Carlin laughed. "Let's get through this week first." Carson patted him on the shoulder and turned and walked away. Carlin took one last look at the stage, then he turned too. After that night, Carlin became a regular Tonight Show guest again, for real this time, but there was no materials list, no producer whispering in his ear. Carson gave him the same freedom on every visit. Say what you want to say. In 1977, when Carson went on vacation, he put Carlin in his chair. In 1979, at the peak of his career, he was back on the Tonight Show stage. In 1981, he appeared on the same night as Richard Pryor, two old friends, two different voices, one stage, and in 1992, during one of the program's final seasons, Carson turned to Carlin and asked, "How many times is this?" 105, said Carlin. The third most frequent guest in Tonight Show history, 26 years, 105 nights. But the man sitting in the back of that police car at the start of that count on that June night in 1972 could never have imagined this number. George Carlin passed away in 2008. At his funeral, according to someone who was there, the sentence Carson had told him years ago was the one Carlin pulled out at the end of every story he ever told his closest friends. The door was never closed. It just stayed ajar. Perhaps the bravest thing is sometimes exactly this, believing the door is still ajar, waiting in that dark corridor, and being willing to return. When you find your own voice, nobody can take it from you. George Carlin, maybe today someone is waiting for a message from you. A phone call, a smile. If this story touched your heart, share it and subscribe, because we tell the moments that must not be forgotten.